Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. We're going to be getting started here in just a minute, but I do have some housekeeping announcements. You will be muted during today's presentation. So if you'd like to ask a question, please do enter it into the online Q&A box. The Q&A is a little bit different than the chat. The Q&A allows us to see the questions that way they stay there until we answer them. That way they don't get lost in the chat if anyone decides to kind of chat with one another in the chat box. We'll save time at the end of this presentation to address as many questions as we can. Please feel free to be entering questions in that Q&A throughout, and we'll save time at the end to answer them. This presentation is being recorded and will be made available on the California Labor Lab and Center for Occupational and Environmental Health YouTube page. And all participants who logged in today with your registration email for the full live presentation will receive an email tomorrow with a link to an evaluation form, and that will qualify you for a certificate of completion worth 1 continuing education contact hour. Once you've completed the evaluation, you'll be able to access and print your certificate. Thank you again for joining us, and at this time, I'd like to hand it over to my colleague, Laura Stock.
Hi, everyone. As Nichole said, I'm Laura Stock, and I'm the Director of the Labor Occupational Health Program and also the Director of Community Engagement for the California Labor Lab. And I'm really excited to be able to help host this particular webinar about Fired by an App, Rideshare Drivers' Experience with Discrimination, Harassment, and Unfair Termination. And as people might know, the mission of the California Labor Lab is really to look at changing nature of work, the impact of technology on working conditions, and this webinar goes to the heart of some of the issues that workers are facing. I'm going to be introducing my colleague, Alejandra Domenzain, who's going to be moderating the session. I will be watching the question and answers. To reiterate what Nichole said, we encourage you to put questions there, and we hope we will try to be having time at the end to answer them. But to start out with, I'm going to introduce Alejandra, who's Alejandra Domenzain, who works with me at LOHP, and she was the primary coordinator of our work with this particular study that you're going to be hearing about, and provided support and worked with the group that you'll be hearing from today. As I said, she's a program coordinator at LOHP. She develops projects to improve working conditions of immigrant, low-wage workers in a variety of high-hazard industries through education and leadership development of workers, capacity building of organizations, policy advocacy, and community-based research. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alejandra.
Thank you, Laura. I'm so excited to introduce you today to 3 amazing colleagues and panelists. I'm just going to give you the top level of their many achievements, because if not, we could take up the whole hour just with that. But I'll start with Nichole Moore, who is a part-time driver who became one of the founding members of Rideshare Drivers United in 2018. And I can tell you from personal experience, an amazing researcher and organizer. We also have Tyler Sandness, who also is a driver, became an organizer, organized a historic strike at LAX, and now is a statewide coordinator for RDU. And Winnie is senior counsel for impact litigation at the Asian Law Caucus, and really played a key role in coordinating this project. And I've had the pleasure of also working with her on other research projects. So also just, really appreciate her insightful role in asking the right questions and pulling out all the conclusions that came from the data. So you're really going to hear from the people that made this amazing, report happen, and hear how it's going to be used. So with that, let's start. And so I would love to hear, maybe we can start with Nichole. You can give us a little bit of the background, like what was the landscape that you're operating on that made you want to do this research? And, I know that it's like, on the one hand, you're looking at the workforce, right, which is dealing with being a gig worker, being misclassified, being managed by an app. And then on the other hand, you're dealing with the public, right, the customers who are a cross section of America, and all the complications and kind of isms that come from that. So yeah, what were you seeing that that really motivated you to embark on this research?
Yeah, so just a little bit about Rideshare Drivers United. We're an organization of around 20,000 drivers in California. and, you know, we literally started in the parking lot of LAX, fighting against our reduced wages, some of the conditions we've been working under and that kind of thing. And we've become, you know, part of the landscape to, fighting for fairness, rights, and for all ride-hail workers, as well as everybody deployed by apps. And, you know, the situation that we're really in is that we are managed by algorithms, right? Let me just see if I can forward the slide. So most of us came to this work because we really don't like the situation on screen. We don't like to be micromanaged. We don't like to have abusive bosses. We really love being in a car, sort of managing our work and, picking up passengers, good customer relations, that kind of stuff. And so we rejected this model, only to find out that this is the model. This is what is actually managing us, from everything to where we work, when we work, how much we make when we work, how many hours we spend on the road. The algorithms know exactly how much you have to earn, and they know that they're going to have a bunch of passengers that need rides at 3 a.m. So they'll stretch you out till, 3 a.m. to meet your goal. There's just, it's incredible how closely managed we are. And, it ends up looking much more like this for us, not like code. Basically, our phones are yelling at us to chase this dollar or pick up this passenger. And it is not an independent situation at all. And you quickly learn that as a driver. And, and I think probably the most harsh piece of control, and one of the things they use to really manage us is through deactivation, where basically they get rid of our ability to earn. And generally the deactivation, which is, just short for termination, or a temporary termination, it can be as well. All of this is basically done also through algorithms, right? So basically we're in the situation of being fired by an app, a robot, so to speak. Let me just, I think one of the things that we do is we do gather and talk to each other. And the reason we built Rideshare Drivers United was really in order to be able to share information and fight together against this stuff. And so your question is, why did we want to look into this situation around deactivation? After pay, deactivation is always the number 2 issue in all of the member surveys that we've done in California. And it bears the same across the country and the world. Deactivation is extremely dehumanizing. One of the things that people often hear is that they have been deactivated for fraudulent activity, it's called. And so I actually accompanied a colleague of mine who was deactivated for fraudulent activity to the Uber hub, which is where there's actually personnel there that are supposed to help you with your problems as a driver. And so, when we got help, he asked, well, what was the fraudulent activity that I was engaged in, or that you think I was engaged in? And the woman looked through the files. She says, it just says fraudulent activity. I mean, not even the humans know exactly what the algorithms are spitting out and why. So there's no way to defend yourself. There's no, often we're not even told the time frame that this alleged activity happened. So even if we have, dash cam, we can't necessarily share it. And sometimes drivers have provided dash cam footage of an alleged whatever, and we find that they won't accept the dash cam video. So this is a very real and palpable issue. And, you know, in addition to actually getting temporarily deactivated or permanently deactivated, there's always these little pings like, oh, you haven't accepted enough rides, you've canceled too many of this, you know, you're at risk of deactivation. So it is very much an issue of control. And understand, part of the issue here is that, you know, we're living in this world where people believe that because our boss is not human, we must not have a boss, right? And what that really is misclassification. We're misclassified, and therefore we don't have rights, you know, for basic labor rights like minimum wage, like, you know, workers' compensation, unemployment insurance, and protection from discrimination, protection for worker safety. This is the world that we live in, even though we do have a boss who's an algorithm. And I think what you said was right on, which is that we also are driving with America in the back seat, right? So the majority of us in rideshare driving are people of color and immigrant drivers. And so all the biases of America put themselves right in our face and result in, you know, certainly not all customers, but all it takes is one out of 1,000 who can make such a damaging complaint about you that it results in deactivation, even if nothing happened. So, I mean, that's the basic framework of why we said, let's really look at deactivation. Nobody really has looked at it. We want to look at how it impacts drivers in general. We want to look and see if the biases that we're experiencing in the car play out. And those were kind of, that was the framework that we looked at, and we're able to partner with Asian Law Caucus to do a really deep dive into this. So that's just a frame for how we came to do the study.
Thank you so much. And Tyler, maybe you can tell us a little bit. I thought that the worker stories and their experiences were so incredibly powerful. Can you share some of those with us?
Absolutely. So I really want to thank Nichole in terms of the framing, because yeah, this is the reality that drivers face, is a place where they face dangers and indignities from their customers every single day. And I just want to start with two quotes that I think really capture the experience of a lot of drivers as they do this work. So one of them saying, and again, quote, "I have been insulted for my race, gender, and sexuality. I have been touched in unwanted ways by men and women and gotten advances and proposals. I have made reports to the company, but nothing has ever been reported back to me." So they're facing these abuses, and it's a system in which they do not feel like they have a lot of agency about the abuses that they face. However, this other quote really illustrates how the company is a two-tier system. So, quote, "I was assaulted physically by a customer and immediately reported it. 4 days later, I was deactivated. I was a top-tier driver for 4 years with the highest rating with no complaints." So just as Nichole was saying earlier, all it really takes is one complaint from a customer. Doesn't need to be substantiated. No evidence, no due process, nothing. And a driver's life is automatically turned upside down. And they face income insecurities because of it. Drivers who are deactivated and they are found not to be at fault generally are not given, money or compensation for the time that they're off the road. And so this is a big problem. It's something that we really wanted to dig into. So those are just two quotes, but there's also a couple of stories that I want to share with the audience today about some of these deactivation stories that we have seen and that we've done deeper dives into. So the first story is of a Middle Eastern driver in Los Angeles who was deactivated from the platform because the facial recognition software to determine whether or not a driver is who they say they are on the account did not recognize him. And the reason that it didn't recognize him is because he had grown his beard out and he was wearing glasses on the photo that they asked him to send to verify it was him. We're also dealing with software that is famously biased and calibrated towards white faces. So any driver of color is already up against a challenge of dealing with these facial recognition algorithms as they're trying to do work. Again, this driver has been off the platform now for months. We're currently trying to get him back on the platform, but even if we do, he likely will not be compensated, even though he's a victim of, again, their algorithm not acting right. Another story, we have a Cantonese driver in San Francisco who was accused of sexually harassing his customer. Now, the problem with this is that, you know, he's got camera footage. He did not interact with this customer in that way. And what it seems like what happened is that that customer, knowing that if he makes some kind of report to the company that something went wrong, he can claim a free ride. He will get compensated by the company. He won't have to pay for that ride. And what was a free ride to that customer has now turned into a nightmare for this driver, who is not only knocked off of one platform, but is now basically blacklisted across all platforms. He cannot get a ride, he cannot get a job in the rideshare industry because now it shows up in his background check that this was an accusation. Again, customer didn't provide any proof. There was no investigation into this. All it was a report on an app. And now this driver is blacklisted for off of it. Again, another driver that we're trying to get back on the job. But again, even if we do, likely will not be compensated for the time off of the platform because, again, he's been misclassified. He's not entitled to those wages, only access to the platform, which can be taken away at any moment. Last story I want to share with you. COVID was a huge deal during the pandemic, and drivers really were on the front line of having to enforce safety rules, which often put them in conflict with customers. I'm sure that many people here have known a person that, you know, resisted mask mandates, didn't always act safe. Well, imagine having to deal with that every single day, multiple times a day with customers who do not want to follow guidelines. Drivers under California law were required to enforce safety mandates, required to tell their customers, you need to mask up, you need to maintain distance, you need to respect the safety protocols. And what would happen is that a customer would then turn that into a confrontation with a driver where, again, they can't make a complaint that the driver is trying to enforce safety rules, but they can complain that they smell alcohol in the car or they smell marijuana in the car. Again, no evidence, no proof, but that customer may know that they just need to insinuate that there is some kind of substance use or some kind of unsafe driving, and they know that that algorithm is going to knock that driver off the platform. And that driver is going to have to wrestle with the company to get back on the platform. Again, you have a system here that's not about, you know, trying to get to the truth of the matter or try to advocate for their drivers. What you have is a money-saving system that's looking for keywords that, you know, again, just if it sees a keyword, alcohol, marijuana, unsafe driving, sexual harassment, whatever it is, that's all that it takes to get a driver knocked off the platform. No physical evidence, no photo evidence, no audio, nothing. All it takes is that. And drivers are then, you know, they're left in the lurch. Many of them, this is their full-time job. They build their lives off of the flexibility to drive when they want to and the income that it provides them to take care of their families. And at any moment, that whole world could be turned upside down without any kind of advocacy or any forum for them to defend themselves. It's a system that saves the companies money. It saves them the time and energy of actually having to get to the truth of the matter, but it is not invested and it is not interested in protecting and supporting its workers.
Wow, thank you for sharing that, Tyler. I think those stories really point out, you know, what Nichole was saying, that just because there's not a human there doesn't mean you're not being judged, right, and being disciplined and being affected. And you're right, it's not just your livelihood, which is really important, but even just your own health and safety, you know, as you were alluding to, and you may be, you know, harassed, you may be physically assaulted, right? People are like literally in your face, in your space, with these perverse incentives to literally get a free ride. So it really puts a highlight on that system that's really broken. So I want to ask Winnie now if you can tell us, like, what was the methodology of the report? What came out as the main findings from this research?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Let me just try to get the slide going. Yeah, so I think that, again, as Nichole mentioned, we tried to put together the survey and report, not only to document kind of these stories, but just to see the breadth. And I think one of the most important things I thought about the survey and report was that it really did show that these driver experiences we were hearing about were not isolated. Instead, I think the survey and report really show that the experiences are disturbingly widespread and clearly indicate systemic problems that really need to be addressed. So yeah, just a little bit about the survey and kind of the who we were talking to or what the survey captured. It was an online survey that we put together in part with Alejandra's expertise and other folks on the team. It's a survey that we did in the summer and fall of 2022, and it really focused on California Uber and Lyft drivers. And we tried to capture drivers who had driven at any point in the prior 3 years. So it did capture driver experiences during the pandemic, which we were very interested in. We got approximately 810 responses from current and former Uber and Lyft drivers in California. 81% of those drivers said that they were driving for Uber and Lyft as their primary source of income. About 68% of the survey drivers were people of color. 25% identified as white, 55% were immigrants. Most were male. So 81% identified as male, about 15% as female, and most did drive in kind of the urban centers around San Francisco, LA, or the San Diego metropolitan region. So in terms of key findings, a shocking 2/3 of the drivers that we surveyed reported that they were deactivated at some point, either by Uber or Lyft or both. Some on a temporary basis and others on a permanent basis. Significantly, while the deactivation rates were high across the board, drivers of color were definitely more likely to have been deactivated than white drivers. Overall, 69% of drivers of color that we surveyed experienced some kind of deactivation, compared with 57% of drivers who identified as white. And as you'll see from the bar graph to the right, some of the numbers for the various groups were compared with white drivers in terms of deactivation were disturbingly high. Additionally, we did note that immigrant drivers appear to be more negatively impacted by deactivation than their counterparts. So about 70% of surveyed drivers who were born outside of the US had experienced some form of deactivation, compared with about 60% of drivers who were born in the United States. Drivers who did not speak English well were also disproportionately impacted. The results of deactivation were devastating. So, for the drivers where Uber and Lyft was their primary source of income, which was overwhelmingly the case for the survey drivers, it meant that they were losing their livelihoods. So 18% reported losing their cars, 12% said they ended up losing their home. 28% reported difficulties with medical bills and costs. A significant percentage reported difficulties paying for childcare, school-related, child-related expenses. And the consequences were not just financial. 59% reported feelings of depression. More than half reported experiencing family stress or conflict. 7% reported substance abuse issues as well. And as with the loss of any job, as Nichole and Tyler mentioned, Drivers understandably wanted to know why are we being fired or terminated, but 30% told us that they weren't given any explanation or reason at all. Of those who could point to some kind of explanation that they were given for their deactivation, a disturbing 42% said that they were told by Uber or Lyft that the deactivation was due to a customer complaint. 10% were told that it was due to a low customer rating. And now this is problematic, though, if America is in the backseat of your car, and if deactivations based on customer complaint or a low customer rating are not checked or mitigated in any way. And so we did ask questions about driver experiences with customer discrimination and found that drivers were experiencing all kinds of customer discrimination that directly put their jobs at risk. So an alarming 2/3 of surveyed drivers reported that they felt that they experienced some form of customer bias or discrimination at some time while they were driving for Uber and Lyft, based on various protected categories. But would note that over half reported experiencing customer acts of bias or discrimination due to their race or national origin. Many, in terms of what form of discrimination, reported fielding explicitly discriminatory comments about their race or the protected category. Some reported getting fewer tips, less tips, having these customer complaints made against them, lower ratings, and the like. Notably, it wasn't just kind of the protected categories that we were talking about in terms of comments, but also alarming rates of sexual harassment and even assault while driving for these companies. 43% of the surveyed drivers reported experiencing sexual harassment on the job. 47% reported being touched inappropriately by passengers. So I would just note again that of the half who, half of survey drivers who reported experiencing some form of discrimination due to, either gender, race, other protected categories, they reported that that customer also gave them a low rating. And 1/3 to half of the drivers who said they experienced bias from customers reported that that customer also filed a complaint against them. So again, a direct kind of impact on their ability to make a living or stay on these platforms. We also asked about the experience that Tyler mentioned of what it was to have to navigate a lot of the COVID health and safety guidelines and enforcement on their own. Many of the drivers surveyed reported suffering negative consequences as a result of those efforts to enforce those protections. 1 in 4 drivers said they got a low rating from a customer who refused to follow COVID safety guidelines. So I'll turn it over back to Nichole.
Thank you, Winnie.
Recommendations. Yeah.
So, so what do we do about this situation, right? As we are starting kind of a deactivation clinic to help drivers regain their employment through the apps when they've been deactivated, it's not a long-term anything. We have almost no rights in this situation. We know there needs to be just cause and due process for drivers. How do you get this in this situation of misclassification? And let's be real, most workers, unless they have a specific union contract that protects them, don't have just cause. Is that really right? I mean, in many ways, I think as a labor movement, we need to do better and demand this the same way we demand minimum wage. But the extra precarity that deactivation poses to app-based workers who at this time don't even have a dependable income, it's untenable. They must have just cause. We have to make sure that companies, regardless of whether they're misclassifying or correctly classifying their employees, there must be protection of workers against bias and discrimination, and not feeding that through basically awarding people for giving, complaints. We need basic employment and labor protections. As we fight for safety, we have Lyft and Uber pushing back, saying that we're not actually even covered under OSHA laws, right? So that's also extremely dangerous. And this is in a, very public facing industry where, passengers are literally putting their lives on the line, getting into these cars where drivers aren't protected, right? It doesn't make the passengers any safer. Workplace violence and sexual harassment is so real. And it's not just, it's across all genders that this is happening in these cars, and we have to do something about that. These are the recommendations that really came out of the report. I think there's a lot of stuff going on right now, workers are organizing around, that I think is important to address. I think we absolutely need regulation in this industry in California. Pay, just cause outside of, there needs to be a company process, but there needs to be a backup process if the company doesn't follow that, right? And we're seeing some really good examples of that emerging. Minnesota narrowly missed passing a law that would have given drivers just cause and fair hearings, that put the pressure on the companies to do that, but then have a backup process if the companies aren't following it. There is current regulation moving in the city of Chicago that also does the same thing. This should be mandated on these companies. And I do believe, and I'll say it again, I think it's a challenge, not just for gig workers, but I think it's a challenge for the labor movement to push forward just cause and fair hearings for all terminations and deactivations. We should not be living in a place where you can be fired for no reason, right? Prop 22 is really holding drivers' rights down in California. It is now sitting in the California Supreme Court, waiting to be heard, and we cross our fingers for a good decision that it be overturned, because that's when we can begin to regulate all the things we've been talking about today.
Nichole, maybe you can say a little bit more about what Prop 22 is, just in case there are people who are not familiar with it. Yeah.
Sorry, yeah, inside baseball. But Prop 22 is the law that passed in 2020. It was the industry's pushback when California put in place the ABC test that basically makes it harder for companies like Uber and Lyft to misclassify drivers as independent contractors when they have this level of control over the workforce. And their pushback was, oh, we'll assign you, we'll make a proposition. We'll tell everybody it's going to help workers, give them more rights, and provide independence for this huge workforce of app-based delivery and drivers. And but instead what it did is it codified our misclassification as independent contractors, pretended to give us things like minimum wage and mileage rates, but actually set a floor that was so low that now under Prop 22, another study that we did shows that we're making after expenses and lack of things like unemployment and workers' comp, that we're making around $6.20 an hour. So less than federal minimum wage. So Prop 22 is something that, voters voted for. 40% of the people that voted for it thought they were voting to increase drivers' rights, when in fact what they were doing was putting us in the basement.
Thank you. And we're going to open up to questions in just a minute. But since you mentioned regulation by CalOSHA, I would love, Winnie, if you can just tell us a little bit about that, because I know we have some kind of historic citations of Lyft and Uber under CalOSHA.
Sure. Yeah, actually last year, members of RDU did file complaints just based on, the really difficult conditions under which they were working during the pandemic, ended up filing complaints with CalOSHA, the state labor agency here that enforces health and safety protections. And CalOSHA in August of last year issued citations against both Uber and Lyft for violating some of those really basic protections of just having a injury illness prevention plan, having some kind of basic training, notification of workplace dangers, and other kind of masking requirements that we all depended on and took for granted to some extent. CalOSHA took the position that those do apply to drivers of these companies. The companies appealed, and those citations are pending before the judicial branch within CalOSHA. And some of those, some RDU members being represented by RDU, and now my organization as well, have intervened into those citation appeal hearings to kind of defend those citations and really make the argument that, notwithstanding Prop 22, that those basic protections apply. So we'll see where that goes. But I think it's, these are protections that really should apply regardless of anyone's status.
Absolutely. So yeah, as I'm going to turn it over to Laura to moderate the question and answer period, but I think we're going to also share some links in the chat as well, the link to the report and maybe other ways to get involved. And then I'll turn it to you, Laura, to start taking some of the questions from participants.
Yes, let's unmute myself. So thank you so much for an amazing presentation. And we do have some questions, and I'll just start from the top. For those that were deactivated, is there data on how many of these deactivations were considered unwarranted versus warranted, and self-reported data? So I don't know who might want to answer that. Winnie?
I can try. So we didn't ask that specific question. What we asked drivers is we asked, were you given a reason? And again, it was about 30% or so who said they were given no reason. And then of those who were given a reason, what reason were you given? And then invited people to elaborate and provide more information about their deactivation. So we got a sense from that elaboration that drivers provided about whether they felt it was warranted or not. And we did ask specifically, did you feel that it was related to discrimination from customers based on various categories? So, there was definitely a lot of self-reported, but we do think it highlighted some disturbing trends and issues that certainly should be looked at more closely.
Thank you, Winnie. Did anyone else want to add anything to that, or I can go on to the next question?
I would just add that, because of the lack of regulation, there are actually drivers out there who do things that shouldn't be happening as drivers. And it's bad for our profession for that to be happening as well. I think that, so just to add that.
Yeah, thank you. So another question came from a participant who said, sounds like there are racial grounds to file discrimination claims against Uber and Lyft, especially as de facto discrimination, since it's an algorithm. Is anyone working on these kinds of claims?
I think people are definitely thinking on it. So yeah, we think it's unlawful if an employer knows that a criteria that they're using has a discriminatory impact or is capturing and magnifying bias and discrimination, and then acting on it. And that is what these algorithms are doing. They're using these customer ratings and customer complaints that are infected by bias or discrimination, and then validating it, acting on it. And we think that is raises some serious legal questions and exposure for these companies. I think what's difficult in California, again, is what Nichole mentioned in Prop 22, saying that a set of these anti-discrimination protections that we have in the law don't apply to drivers, but there are still some legal theories, even apart from employee status, that I think drivers and advocates should and have been exploring, including actions under Section 1983. And then Prop 22 itself has, some anti-discrimination protections that it claims within it that I think we should explore and consider pushing as well.
Thank you. And anyone else want to add anything? Let's go on to the next one. Okay, great. So there was a question for you, Winnie. Can you describe the sampling process for the survey? In other words, how are the respondents identified and selected?
Yeah, so the survey was distributed largely through RDU and through our community partners and by ALC. So that there is that sampling bias reality, but we think we did get a broad spread, and I think really we're excited about the number of drivers who responded.
And did you have criteria about numbers of years that people were driving, or any other sampling criteria that you used?
We did. The criteria was you had to have driven for Uber and Lyft in California within the last 3 years.
Okay. Thank you. So next question is, AI legislation hopefully can encompass driver biased algorithms, but what can consumers do, since we likely yield the most power? Makes me not want to take rides. And I'll just jump ahead another along the same lines. Another participant said, do drivers want the public to boycott rideshare companies because of their bad behavior and try to use cabs instead? So it sort of gets at what recommendations might be for consumers who use these apps.
Yeah, so no, sorry, go for it, Nichole.
Oh, sorry, Tyler, go ahead. You got in.
Okay. So no, drivers don't want you not using these apps. Like, this is their livelihood. They depend upon customers in order to make money and support themselves. Ways that you can support drivers, one is, giving a rating every time that you're in the car, preferably 5-star rating. And anything lower than that becomes a liability against the driver. So even if you're trying to reason out, it's like, oh, well, should I give a 4 instead of a 5? The service wasn't that great. If you really want to support that driver, you want to give them a 5-star, because a 4 becomes a liability on their profile and makes it more likely that they'll get targeted for a deactivation later down the road. So that's something that you can do on a daily basis when you use these apps. The other bit is tip, and tip well. These drivers are not being paid well by the companies directly. And so tipping, especially cash, is a really good way to ensure that this driver is being taken care of and is being rewarded for the services they're doing. One really nasty thing that the companies kind of train customers to do in the early days is they train people not to tip. Uber purposefully told their customers, don't tip your drivers. And unfortunately, it's built in a sort of social attitude where people get in that car and then they don't support their driver, but that driver may have only gotten paid $2.62 for your ride. And so tipping is an essential part of that. So if customers are looking for ways to support drivers directly, ratings and tipping are really good practical ways that you can do that.
And Tyler, just to clarify one thing, and then Nichole, I'll go to you. When you were saying tipping in cash, I know a lot of customers wonder whether if they tip in the app, it gets to the drivers directly. Or so I just wanted to give you an opportunity to comment on whether cash is really important, or the other does not get to the drivers.
Yeah, and that's something that we have seen where the companies will basically dip into drivers' tips as part of their fees. in order to shortchange the driver. So that's where cash or using a separate app like Venmo or Cash App becomes, an important element to this to ensure that the driver is getting the full value of the tip.
Thank you. And then Nichole, what would you like to add?
I just would add that I think one of the other ways that the companies are training people not to tip is the same thing that's happening to us, which is we're seeing continued reductions in our pay. Just the opposite is happening to the passengers. I mean, I'm seeing rides that 3 years ago would have cost somebody $50, now being $100 or $120. What customers need to know is that drivers are getting sometimes as little as 20% of your fare. The rest is going to the company, even though we pay for the cars and most of the insurance and everything else, right? So anyway, so that's another really important thing. We're doing some experiments on how to make that transparent because it is a huge misunderstanding. People think that drivers get 80% of the fare. In fact, when I started in 2017, I was guaranteed 80% of the fare, and they quickly took that away shortly after I started. What I would also say, and hello, Faith, it's nice to see you. What I would say is that there's lots of room for passenger organizing. We've always gotten a little bit here and a little bit there, customers wanting to organize. It's also a good way for customers to share information about drivers-united.org, like get involved, like passengers, a great way to do that. And we've had little fits and starts in that, but I think there's a lot of space there. There's even a website set up, that one effort set up called Drivers Unite, or Passengers, Riders United is what it's called. And so anyway, there's a lot of opportunity there for passengers that want to help create justice for drivers. And we are happy to partner with folks on that.
Thank you. A couple of more questions. Somebody asked if any customers have been identified as repeat false reporting. So gets back to just thinking more about the stories of false reports and whether, particularly when you see the incentives that are built into the system to encourage that, is anybody capturing on whether they're
Who knows?
Who knows? And
yeah, who knows? Like when I've reported sexual harassment from a passenger, are they deactivated from the app? Who knows, right? We have no transparency on that. And there's no regulation that says it should happen, whether it's a harassing customer, a customer that uses a false name, et cetera, et cetera. There's no accountability. There's no transparency on that stuff.
Yeah. And just to expand what Nichole just said there, customers, again, even if they are knocked off the platform and punished that way, it's very easy for them to get back onto that platform. Prepaid cards, using other people's accounts. And so, deactivation of a customer is much less of a consequence than the deactivation of a driver is. They're nowhere near comparable to each other, even if the behavior is.
Thank you. So another question was, are the rideshare companies open to partnering with you for solutions? So have you done any work with Uber or Lyft, and what kind of response have you had?
They don't want to acknowledge that we exist.
Anything else to add, Nichole?
Yeah, so I can expand on that.
Right.
So the companies don't seem to take, the criticism that we're laying out very well. And in fact, they want to pretend that organizations like RDU don't exist. And honestly, RDU wouldn't really want to have that relationship outside of a union contract with the companies. One thing that we're concerned about is that there is a streak of yellow unionism increasing across the United States, where Lyft and Uber are approaching established unions to create basically HR departments under a union label that will handle deactivations. It handles some discrepancies between the company, but are directly receiving money from the company in exchange, which means that those unions are no longer operating independently and now have created a conflict of interest between the income that they receive from the company and their obligation to be stewards of drivers' interests. And so, although we eventually want to get to a place to where RDU and Lyft and Uber can sit down at a table and get a union contract agreement that can protect drivers' rights, we wouldn't want to work with them in any context outside of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and deactivation is actually one of the ways that the companies approach unions to try to solve that issue, and it is not a solution at all. You know, we believe very much that you know, the organization we're creating is one that's led by drivers, that's democratic, and that is not funded by the companies. We have to have our independent voice in this. It is, you know, we've seen one of the union in New York, the Independent Drivers Guild, has fought against drivers' rights to have unemployment insurance, right? I mean, that is not in the interest of drivers, obviously. And so, you know, we believe that we need to make those kinds of unions actually would be illegal under US law if it wasn't for misclassification, right? So let's just be clear about the kind of labor movement we want to build.
Yeah, thank you. And just to follow up on that, Nichole, the question I was going to ask is what's happening nationally on these issues. And is your organization a national organization? I forget whether you mentioned that at the beginning, or if you have anything more to say about the landscape nationwide.
Yeah, great question. I mean, we are largely a California-based organization, but we do everything that we can to support drivers who are trying to organize across the country, and we have to be working with each other to try to push national laws and regulation that can be very helpful. Right now, there's definitely movement, you know, nationally around stopping misclassification, on dealing with you know, algorithmic decision making and those kinds of things. And we're involved in those conversations, along with conversations around how do we incentivize, you know, rideshare to be, you know, not carbon producing vehicles, you know, and, you know, those are very important conversations that drivers' voices have to be there, because government regulators often think that the way to incentivize electric vehicles is to incentivize it with the companies. And we had to explain to them that the fleet is owned by hundreds of thousands of working class people that are sitting in their parking places at their apartment building. And you have to, you know, help drivers get those vehicles. So, you know, we're involved in a lot of those conversations. There has to be much bigger efforts. I mean, we saw with Prop 22, they spent more than $200 million to pass that legislation, which is why if you were here in California during that fight, you saw so many ads. It's hard to spend $200,000 on a single proposition. And but there's a huge mega force of lobbying and stuff that's been funded by efforts like that. And you know, if you've gone into like there was a civil rights hearing about AB5, which is our ABC test here, and that you know it was like the Twitter wars were thrown at, you know, national regulators trying to figure out if the ABC test is against people's civil rights. And you know, if you've been in some of those Twitter rooms, these are the people who are arguing against you know, simple ABC tests that have been around in this country for years. So there's a real war to try to make the kind of work that Tyler and I have experienced, along with the, you know, hundreds of thousands of other app-based workers, the law of the land. I mean, we had a real scare here in California when somebody was considering moving a proposition to make healthcare jobs app-based, right? And thus, turning them into independent contractors, Prop 22ing them. And we just have to be really careful about the road we're on right now. So it's a national fight. And what I would say is it's actually an international fight. Uber has footprints around the world, and we're involved in very powerful fights internationally as well. We have to think really big. It's not a little problem that a few people are experiencing. This is a direction that a lot of people want to see labor rights go, and we're the people that have to stop it. People who are here listening, drivers, and we have to build and fight back.
Thank you so much, Nichole. I want to just mention very briefly, because you referenced the ABC test, and again, that may not be something that everybody's familiar with, but it's a set of criteria that are used to determine whether somebody is an independent contractor or not, who controls the work tasks, who provided direction, and who controls the production and the pace. And there's a set of criteria that have been used for a long time to determine whether or not somebody is an employee or an independent contractor. And that is where there was the Supreme Court decision in California where it said, yes, these kinds of jobs, they are employees according to that test. And then Prop 22 reversed that. So just to give a little bit of that background.
Thank you.
And I know we're coming to the last few minutes. I want to mention there's one other comment where somebody specifically says the mention of the 5-star rating as opposed to a 4-star with tremendously valuable data. Thank you. And that's from a union rep who's listening. And we just have a couple of minutes left, but I want to turn it over to Alejandra and anybody else who would like to make any final comments.
No, I mean, I think I just want to echo what all of us have been saying about that. This is really powerful, not just for rideshare drivers, but really, like, Nichole has said so eloquently, it's about labor rights. It's about what kind of labor movement we want to have. It's about what kind of labor laws we want to have. And so I think it's so strategic, right? It's a bigger fight. It's about this whole gig economy. It's not inevitable that it has to be predatory, right? It's not inevitable that it has to erode rights rather than build them up. There's a version of driver control, all the things that Nichole said, a lot of people are seeking the flexibility. There's a version where drivers have that and they have basic protections under the law. We have just chosen, right? Or these companies have chosen a business model where they're in conflict, but it doesn't have to be that way, right? That's all on us, on the policy and the organizing and the things that we support.
Yes, thank you so much. And I wanted to note also that the link to that full report was put in the chat. So we encourage people to take a look and see more details about that report. And of course, encourage people to really think about the things that we've been talking about today and see the actions that we can take to try to address some of these really critical issues. And so, Michelle, I don't know whether I need to turn it over to you for any final comments or to close things out.
Sure. Well, thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. And just be on the lookout you'll get an email from noreply@zoom.us that'll have a link to the evaluation form for today's webinar. And we look forward to hearing your thoughts. And thank you so much again to all of our panelists who joined today. We appreciate you taking the time to be here.
Yes, thank you so much.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.